Oops. All right, we're just opening the doors now for today's webinar. If you're joining us for the Gaza, the briefing on the Gaza catastrophe, this is the private briefing series for the 118th Congress. You're in the right place. We're going to give it a minute or so for people to get into the room, and then we will get started. So thank you for your patience. We'll start exactly at 3 minutes after, so there's time to go and grab a coffee or something off the other desk. And again, if you're just joining us, we are about to start our webinar. So be patient. We're going to give this about 30 more seconds. There's still people entering the room. And then we will go ahead and get started. All right, so I'm going to go ahead now. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first session of our four-part congressional briefing series, the Gaza Catastrophe, a private briefing series for the 118th Congress. I'm Laura Friedman. I'm the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm very pleased to be co-hosting this series with my friend and colleague Khaled El-Gindi, who is director of the Middle East Institute's program on Palestine and Palestinian affairs.
Thanks, Laura. Today's session is called How We Got Here. And as the name suggests, we'll be looking at the current situation on the ground, as well as how we got to this point, including the events, obviously, of October 7th, as well as broader issues like conditions in the West Bank, as well as the regional environment, the Israel-Lebanon border, and other regional dynamics, as we saw over the events over the past week. So to help us dig into these issues, we've assembled an excellent panel of two experts who have really unique insights into the topic. First, we have Mkhaimar Abusada, who is a professor at the Al-Azhar University of Gaza and formerly chaired the university's political science department. He is joining us. He is from Gaza, but he's joining us from Cairo. And we also have Mairav Zonszein, who is senior analyst on Israel-Palestine at the International Crisis Group, and she is joining us from Tel Aviv. You can read the panelists' full bios on the landing page for this event. Our colleagues will put links into the chat box, so keep an eye out there for Twitter handles and other resources from our experts. And if you miss anything in the chat, don't worry. All of these materials will be posted on the webpage afterward.
Great. So last bit of housekeeping before we get started. The format for this session, like all the sessions in the series and in our previous series, if you've attended those, it will be a moderated Q&A led by Khaled and myself. We have some basic questions. Actually, we have a lot of questions because this is a really great panel. We're really excited to ask our questions. But we also would love to have your questions. So you can submit your questions via the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom window. We really will try to work your questions in. We want to answer what you're interested in as well. Submit them at any time during the webinar, and we'll keep watch. And last thing, this webinar is being recorded. So heads up. And also, if you have any technical problems or questions about the webinar, put those into the chat box and our colleagues can respond to you there. And with that, let's begin.
Great. Mairav, I'd like to start with you. There's a lot of confusion as well as misinformation about what happened on October 7th. Could you describe for us how those events transpired as you experienced them, and of course, everything that we've learned since then? We know that about 1,200 people were killed and another 250 or so Israelis were taken hostage on that day. Can you give us a sense of the big picture? How many were civilians versus military and police? Where were they? We know that some of the Israelis, at least, were killed by Israeli forces themselves. Do we have a sense of how many they were? Who was responsible uh, for what on that really terrible day?
Yeah, thanks, Khalid and Lara, for having me. I wish it was under better circumstances. It's funny because when I saw the questions, the first question, it was like, oh, that's just feels like ages ago. And the truth is that a lot of what happened on that day is still being investigated, being uncovered. And the IDF has only just to begin its own investigation of what happened. So I think it's important to take into account that some aspects of that day, I think, will never become clear. And specifically, if we jump right into the sexual assault and rape allegations, because of the chaos of that day, there's just not forensic evidence that was taken. It was just so much going on for so many hours that I think there's certain things that we'll just never be able to know for sure. And that makes the disinformation and the silos on each side even harder to dispute. But in terms of the numbers, I mean, it was roughly 800 civilians and 400 security forces, mostly soldiers, but also police and others. That's the basic breakdown as far as I know. So a majority of civilians, many women and children involved as well. And I think what's important to remember about that day is that there were actually less soldiers stationed in the Gaza border area than there were in the West Bank, for example. And there's a lot of speculation, but also starting to come out more and more facts about the fact that there were certain divisions or brigades that were moved from that area to the West Bank. And if we get into this a little bit later, what happened up until October 7th was primarily a lot of violence happening as well in the West Bank, a lot of settler violence, and we can get into that later. But I think, basically what we understand from October 7th was that Israel was caught completely off guard. And it took hours and hours and hours for forces to respond. And Hamas was very, very well organized and had thousands of people involved in this in a way that just completely overtook the, multi-million-dollar border fence that Israel had invested in. And so it did it in a lot of different ways. And there are plenty of good reports out there about exactly what transpired and how. So I'm not going to get into all of that. But it was clearly something that up until this day, you have people like the former head of the Shin Bet saying, I still don't understand how it went down the way it went down. And so that is something that will, I think, be, have to be investigated for years to come, really. I'll stop there.
So if I could just follow up with you, Mairav, and really on that last point, Gaza is, for those of us who follow this closely, we think of Gaza as one of the most, if not the most heavily surveilled area, the Gaza border certainly on Earth, and Gaza as a whole. And Israel, I mean, takes great pride in and even exports its surveillance and military technology, which has been developed to secure Gaza and the Gaza border. Um, can you talk a little bit more about what those arrangements are? And I mean, I think for a lot of people, it's just extraordinary that such a massive attack could have been planned and carried out, apparently unnoticed. I know there was some reporting in the Israeli press about people who tried to raise alarms that something looked like it was happening. I don't know if you want to talk about that, but really, what does this failure mean for the future of Israel's, I mean, deterrence, as it likes to think about it, but also it's vaunted intelligence, security apparatus, and industry.
Yeah, so I think it's not that it didn't go unnoticed. I think there were a lot of alarm bells in military intelligence and in the establishment, and there's been reports coming out about how much they actually did know about this manual, about this entire plan. I think it was called I forget now what the name of it was, but like they had a file that they knew that Hamas was planning something. So it's not that it went unnoticed, it's more that it went unheeded. And a lot of the Israeli discourse about it is that the people in power simply didn't interpret the intelligence properly or didn't take it to enough of a higher up. And again, those things are still, coming to the fore. And I don't know all the details about it, but in terms of the effect of it, and I think what we see very clearly is that Israel completely undermined and really, out of sight, out of mind. They said that they left Gaza in 2005. They tried to put it into this corner of the world that they didn't have to think about. They put up all these walls. They put up all these defense systems. They invested tons of money into surveillance, and then they didn't really pay attention to what was going on there. And so it's a lesson that no matter how much military power and money you might have, that you need people understanding what is going on in the fabric of that society. And there's a sociologist in Israel, Yagil Levy, who talks about how the dehumanization of Palestinians reached such a level that they didn't even think that Palestinians had agency of any kind to come up with such a thing, or the audacity. And that's part of just the hubris and the level of impunity that Israel has acted on. And if you ask an Israeli, where would the explosion of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict be, they would never say Gaza. They would never guess it would come from Gaza, even though you had a lot of alarm bells and you had years and years of different efforts, and not just in Gaza, because you have to also think about the Palestinians as one people, and a lot of the issues that Hamas has raised about why it organized this attack have to do with things that are happening not in Gaza. But effectively, this is something that for Israel's national security, which was already being undermined and damaged before October 7th, because of the way in which the far-right government was trying to undermine even some of the minimal basic democratic mechanisms that Israel has. There were warnings that this is going to hurt the way Israel appears to its adversaries. And I think that this was one of the reasons why it triggered the timing of this attack, because Hamas knew that Israel was very weak and that its public was losing trust in its government. And since then, we've seen that even be exacerbated and deteriorated even more. So for Israel, it's a real blow to its invincibility.
Thanks, Mairav. Mkhaimar, I'd like to turn to you now and ask you, how did events transpire on the Palestinian side of Gaza? You were there at the time. How many took part? Who took part? How many belonged to Hamas or Islamic Jihad or other armed groups versus were there civilians that opted to join and into the mayhem of that day? And if you could also talk a little bit about, to the extent that you're aware, the issue that Mairav raised about sexual violence and rape. What do we know about that from the Palestinian side?
Well, thanks very much, Khaled, for this question. But let me first thank you as head of the Middle East Institute, and also thank Lara Friedman as president of the Middle East Peace Foundation. And I want to thank also Mairav for being in this panel with me. Thanks for all of you for organizing this discussion. Going back to your question, well, let me say that until the morning of October 7th, things were semi-quiet in the Gaza Strip. Yes, there has been escalations every now and then between the Gaza Strip and Israel over the past many years. But until that day, things were, as I mentioned, quiet. There were roughly 18,000 Palestinian laborers working inside Israel. Hamas was getting Qatari cash to support the power station, even to pay the salaries of its own employees. I guess signals from the Gaza Strip toward the Israelis were that Hamas wasn't really interested in any escalation with Israel, and the indications for that, as I just mentioned, laborer permits, Qatari cash. In addition to that, there were like two rounds of escalation between Palestinian Islamic Jihad in February, in May of 2023, and also in August of 2023, and Hamas was not involved. And there was, to be honest with you, a lot of criticism against Hamas for not being involved in standing in support for PIJ against Israel. So things were, I can't say normal, because there is nothing normal in the Gaza Strip for many years, but things were quiet and under control until the morning of October 7th, when personally I woke up 6:30 in the morning on the sounds of rockets being fired from Gaza against Israeli towns and villages. Roughly, there were thousands of rockets were launched in that morning to cover up the Hamas attack on the Israeli on the other side of the border. We don't really know much information about how many people. What we know is that Hamas kept this operation very secretive until the last moment of that morning, October 7th. To the best of my knowledge, other Palestinian groups like PIJ and PFLP, Palestinian Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and other smaller Palestinian groups were involved, but they were not involved in the initial attack. The initial attack was very much taken by Hamas solely. Roughly, we're talking about 1,200 Hamas fighters from the so-called elite force within Al-Qassam brigades who have been taken very rough and very severe training for more than a year to carry out such a massive attack against Israel. But right within the first few hours of that morning, after the borders were breached, I guess the news were out, and other Palestinian groups like PIJ, PFLP, DFLP, and other militant groups in Gaza followed suit and went on with the attack, came back with also, in addition to killing, as we all know, roughly 1,200 Israelis, as Mairav just said. Most of them were Israeli civilians, and also Israeli military personnel. Roughly 240 Israeli hostages were brought back to the Gaza Strip, mainly by Hamas, but also by other Palestinian groups. We know PIJ is holding some of them. Also, we knew about 2 months ago when Israel succeeded in liberating 2 of these Israeli hostages, that some of those Israeli hostages were also taken by a smaller Palestinian group called Al-Mujahideen Brigade, which is a tribal brigade in the Gaza Strip. More or less, it was, in my opinion, an attack that was planned by Hamas for more than a year. Even though Hamas has deceived Israel and deceived many intelligence agencies globally and regionally, but it seems to me that what we know is that some indications were sent to the Israelis by the Egyptian intelligence or by also Israeli monitors that there is abnormal activity by Hamas, especially the night before the attack. But all of these signals were ignored, saying that Hamas isn't really interested in any provocation with Israel. But that's what we got at the end of the day, an attack that was unprecedented in terms of its magnitude, in terms of its the number of deaths on the Israeli side, the number of hostages. But honestly, no Palestinian person has ever imagined something like that would ever happen. As you just mentioned at the beginning of this, we have always thought between ourselves or among ourselves that the Israeli barrier between Gaza and Israel is not breachable. Is not. I mean, Israel has invested a lot of money, a lot of effort in that wall that cannot be broken. But I guess Hamas has its own way of doing things. Hamas, I have to admit and say that in many occasions has surprised not just the Palestinians, but also the Israelis in finding ways or new ways to breach rules of the game.
So let me follow up. The unprecedented scope you referred to. I want to ask you what your thoughts are on what Hamas thought would be the results. And also their end game. I mean, this was an unprecedented attack in terms of scope, in terms of planning, in terms of impacts, in terms of deaths and kidnapping and all of that, and the blow to Israel's deterrence. Surely Hamas leaders anticipated a devastating response. I think a lot of us, suspect that's why they did the kidnapping and trying to have something to bargain with. But did they miscalculate? And who was responsible, by your understanding, for the decision making? The leadership inside the Gaza Strip, leadership outside the Gaza Strip, and to what extent was there a role played by outside actors, like Hezbollah or Iran?
Well, Lara, to be honest with you, we do not really have definite answers to who was responsible to this attack on October 7th. What we know is that Sinwar, who is the head of Hamas political bureau in Gaza, is the number one person who is head of Hamas. So we also know other personalities like Muhammad Deif, who is the so-called head of Al-Qassam brigades, and his deputy, Marwan Isa, who was supposedly killed by Israel about 3 weeks ago or a month. Now, but we also know from very insider information that Hamas leadership in Qatar didn't know about this attack. That's what I know. It was an attack that was planned slowly by Hamas leadership in Gaza. Mainly these 5 personalities, Yahya Sinwar, Muhammad Deif, and Marwan Isa. Hamas leadership outside of Gaza didn't know about it. Hezbollah admitted not knowing anything about this. In a speech, Hassan Nasrallah, in the first days of this attack, came out publicly, said that Hezbollah was not notified about this attack. Hezbollah was notified after this attack was carried out on the morning of October 7. Now, what was the end game? To be honest with you, we are trying to find the answers. Yes, I mean, you can find all the excuses to say why Hamas carried out this attack. You can say that this is the result of 56 years of Israeli occupation. This is the result of Israeli settlement expansion in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. This is the result of Israeli settler violence against the Palestinians in the West Bank. This could also be the result of, for the first time, the most right-wing government coalition in Israel that includes ministers like Ben Gvir and Smotrich, who have been, especially Ben Gvir, trying to basically destabilize the status quo in Al-Aqsa Mosque, where he has stormed Al-Aqsa Mosque many times over the past year and also before that. You can bring all these excuses to say that's what happened, but you can also say that a part of this attack on Israel on October 7 was carried out to free Palestinian prisoners. But to be honest with you, when we think and analyze what happened, Hamas could have just went on a small operation, killed some Israeli soldiers, and brought some Israeli soldier hostages to exchange them for Palestinian prisoners, like what they did in June of 2006 when they kidnapped the Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit and exchanged him for more than 1,000 Palestinian prisoners, including Yahya Sinwar was one of them who were freed on that prisoner exchange deal. But to be honest with you, an attack like this one, with this magnitude, with this number of deaths and hostages, I just don't know what was in the mind of those who planned this attack. And to be honest with you, Sinwar claimed that he knows the Israeli psyche very well. He knows the Israeli mentality very well. He spent more than 27 years inside Israeli jails. He has translated from Hebrew many Israeli books on Israeli political system and Israeli politics. And I don't know what was going on in his mind when he planned such an attack without taking into consideration the Israeli massive retaliation. Was he really expecting this kind of retaliation that we are witnessing for the past more than 6 months now? The death, the destruction, the everything that is taking place in Gaza more than 6 months ago. It seems to me one of two things is either Hamas planned this attack, but they did not expect this attack will be successful, as it did happen by killing that many Israeli civilians and Israeli soldiers. and also they did not probably expect that they will be able to bring that many Israeli hostages. As Mairav spoke, I mean, it's just doing that was unexpected. And second, it seems to me that maybe the other scenario is that Hamas didn't think that Israel, who claim all the time that it's one of the most moral, that it has one of the most moral armies in the world, that the Israeli army will not be engaged in such atrocities, killing Palestinian civilian women and children, and do the destruction that has taken place over the past 6 months. It could be that no one in Hamas expected the Israeli massive retaliation like the one we have been seeing for the past 6 months.
Thanks, Mkhaimar. I want to turn to the situation on the ground in Gaza, which I'm just going to outline in some broad terms. I mean, of course, it's impossible, I think, to fully convey the scale of destruction and suffering and collective trauma felt by the civilian population, but it's worth, I think, at least trying. So far, we know. I mean, this war has been described as one of the most, maybe even the most destructive and deadly of the 21st century. We know that at least 34,000 or so Palestinians have been killed, the vast majority of them civilians, mostly actually women and children, about 70% or so. This includes a staggering 14,000, more than 14,000 children. In fact, more children have been killed in Gaza in the last 6 months than in all the conflicts anywhere in the world for the last 4 years combined. More journalists have been killed. More aid workers have been killed than in any other conflict. And in addition, the war has led to widespread destruction of Gaza's civilian infrastructure. 80% of schools have been destroyed or damaged. 5 of Gaza's 7 universities have been destroyed. 26 of Gaza's 37 hospitals have been put out of service. That's in addition to the massive food insecurity because of how people may have forgotten, but on October 9th, Israel imposed a total siege. No water, no fuel, no food, no medicine entering Gaza. And since then, there's been very, very limited amounts of food and humanitarian assistance entering Gaza, which is one of the key frustrations of the US and other governments. And we now have a situation of famine. Depending on who's describing it, famine has already reached the north of Gaza. Most of the rest of the population is facing catastrophic levels of food insecurity. So given this situation, Mairav, I want to turn to you next. Israeli authorities have said all along that they've done all that they can to minimize civilian casualties and harm, and have instead blamed the massive death toll on Hamas's use of Palestinians as human shields, a claim that we also hear often echoed by US and Western leaders. How feasible is that claim? And can it explain this extent? Can the human shields claim really adequately explain the scale, the death toll and the scale of destruction? And if not, then what do we attribute that to?
So, I mean, the rounds that Israel has gone with Gaza since it pulled out have been always increasingly more and more fatal and more forceful in the military power. And this one, because of the October 7th attack, really unleashed something that I think, as Mkhaimar was saying, like it's hard to imagine because of the quote unquote success of the Hamas attack that Israel would go this far. But I think it was it unleashed in Israel 2 things. One, it unleashed this notion of revenge that is definitely playing a role in how this is happening. but it also unleashed what I think certain people, because also of the major blow to the military establishment in its ability to protect Israelis on that day, that they have something to prove and that they need to, fight to the death. But there's also, I think, an understanding in the Israeli establishment on some level that they justify it to themselves when they go to sleep at night that that we have to, sorry, I lost my train of thought, but it's a good one. That we have to basically, I just want to be careful also how I say this, but that we have to replace the society in Gaza, that the society, what has been built there is something that we can't live next to, and that we have to take it apart and rebuild it. And if you look at the way that Netanyahu has talked about his so-called guidelines for Gaza, or if you hear Ron Dermer, his strategic affairs minister, talking, they talk about de-radicalizing Gaza. And I think the way they justify it to themselves, and I'm not legitimizing anything here, but I think that some of them really are convinced that that's how you do it. You take apart all of the infrastructure. And when you talk about civilians and civilian infrastructure, it's two things. It's not just that they take collateral damage. They allow, and there's legal issues here that for years to come are going to be dealt with. And Israel has lots of lawyers working for it. And I think it thinks that it's doing the best that it can to avoid certain legal measures against it. But even with that, and of course, there's a lot of discretion involved, and Israel probably thinks that it can get away with a lot of it. But so other than the collateral damage, I think it simply believes that anybody who is, and we see this now in the north of Gaza with the way that the humanitarian aid crisis and the distribution is happening, Israel will target people who aren't directly affiliated with Hamas, but who work in the police or in civilian, different civilian authorities, and they'll target them as well. And this to them is legitimate. It's a legitimate target. For any other outside observer, it's clear that it's not. And we can also get into the fact that it's not actually, other than being immoral, it doesn't actually serve their own interests. But they're trying to get rid of Hamas completely. And in their goal of getting rid of Hamas as a governing entity, they have to go after the very civilian infrastructures that everybody is saying, is completely illegal and a war crime. So that's part of it. I also think that you are operating in a very, very densely populated area. And so it's very difficult. And if you're ever going to have an operation, Israel's always going to prefer that its soldiers are protected and to take more, risk for the other side than for its own side. So we've also seen that. And we've also know that Israel has a policy that it used in 2006 in Lebanon, the Dahya Doctrine in the suburb of Beirut, where, you destroy. And that is your biggest deterrent. That is your strategy. If you hit them back so hard that they'll just, never want to hit you back again. And so I think it's all those things combined. And I also just, I'm sure that Hamas uses hospitals and other, areas, not only because it's very densely populated, but because it knows that that's a strategy that can work for it. So there's no doubt that that's also happening. Israel hasn't provided evidence of, a major command center under Shifa, but I'm sure Hamas has used it. So that makes things more difficult, obviously. But it's also important to remember that Israel's defense ministry headquarters are in the middle of Tel Aviv, next to the opera house and the library and the museum. So obviously, the moral equivalence is problematic. But I do really think that some Israelis know and understand very clearly that Israel has bombed without, thinking at all about the casualties. And I think some people actually do convince themselves that this is necessary in order to try and remove the threat and rebuild a society from zero.
Thanks, Mairav. Can I ask you just to dig a little bit deeper? There was a recent report in an Israeli outlet, 972 magazine, which has gone around the world looking at Israel's use of artificial intelligence, AI-generated target production, and what that says about Israel's view on collateral damage in terms of what it views as an appropriate ratio for a high-level target versus a low-level target. I think for a lot of us, those numbers were just shocking. And also going back to what you said about, targeting the civilian infrastructure, it almost feels like, Hamas has been running Gaza for, the 16 or so or more years since it took over, with the acquiescence and often the collaboration of the Israeli government. And the Israeli political optic now seems to be anyone who is in any way associated with any governing structure in Gaza is officially Hamas and therefore a target. And then we've got these ratios where we can kill tons of civilians because everyone's a target. Can you just talk about that in the AI piece in particular, which I think really sent a chill down the spine of a lot of the world?
Yeah. Well, I think you summed it up quite well, but I mean, effectively, Israel, because it wanted to go in a way that was so kind of hard and systematic, has created this system that's generated by AI, in which, as you said, it kind of just loosely defines who is considered a legitimate target. And we're talking about thousands and thousands, I think 35,000 people or something like this. And then once it decides to attack these targets, which we, again, we don't know if they've substantiated, and I think we know in certain cases that they aren't substantiated as being Hamas militants. They will then go in and, let's say, bomb a house, knowing that the family is in there, and consider, and while they're sleeping at night, and that's considered, as far as they're concerned, legitimate in terms of their understanding of a target, right? And when you saw, like, for example, the World Central Kitchen convoy strike, I mean, there's no good explanation at all, because there was nobody actually in any of the convoys. But assuming we took their initial explanation that there was somebody armed in the convoy, they also decided that it was worth it for that one person. Again, no idea if this person is even somebody who's instrumental in any way, but just because he might have had an arm, they've decided to kill foreign aid workers in one of the most, well-known humanitarian aid organizations. So this is the kind of thinking that guides the way Israel, targets various people and places in Gaza. And it's something that is in similar ways to how it relied on a lot of its technology on the Gaza border fence. Here, it's also relying very heavily on technology and on machines, and much less on human oversight. And so that's also part of the thinking.
Yeah,
Did
I
I
would just add,
address all your questions?
no, very well. Yeah, I would add, thinking a little bit about Khaled's introduction, for those of us who've been watching the attacks since the beginning, what appears to be really the systematic targeting of journalists, the systematic targeting of health workers, doctors, suggests that whatever this targeting system, however it is picking its targets, its definition of who is a legitimate target is broad enough that it somehow includes journalists and
And with a
doctors,
known
professors.
10% error.
Yeah, it's the numbers speak for themselves. So it's less. It's an important thing, I think, for those of us who are, when the analysis is this is a densely populated area, so people, stuff happens as if it's just collateral damage, but we have homes of journalists being bombed at night when the journalist comes home, that kind of thing. So I think you've addressed that really well. Mkhaimar, coming to you, I want to pick up on Khaled's question. I mean, the scale of destruction in Gaza is so vast and all-encompassing that many believe, I believe personally, that Israel's goal is not simply to, quote unquote, defeat Hamas. I mean, maybe even less about defeating Hamas, but ultimately about erasing Palestinian Gaza and making Gaza unlivable in general or unlivable for Palestinians in whole or in parts. How do Palestinians on the ground see Israel's endgame today?
Well, as a Palestinian, we very much believe from the beginning, Israel, in a very systematic way, was trying to demonize the Palestinian people in Gaza, was in a way trying to dehumanize them in a number of ways. Let me remind you with what was said by the Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, who said those in Gaza are human animals. And basically, he wasn't differentiating between Hamas or the more than 2 million people in Gaza. Or also a statement by the Israeli Minister of Culture, I believe his name is Amichai Eliyahu, who very much proposed throwing a nuclear bomb on the Gaza Strip and killing all the Palestinians in Gaza. I can just bring many other statements from many other Israeli officials who very much at the beginning of this Israeli retaliation were calling for the expulsion of the Palestinians. An ex-Israeli minister, Danon, who spoke publicly about the need to expel the Palestinian people from Gaza. We also know that in a private meeting for the Likud party, it was also discussed, the issue of expelling the Palestinian people from Gaza, and Netanyahu responded by saying that we are trying to find a place for them, which would mean that most of the Israeli political elite or the members of the Israeli cabinet, whether it's the war cabinet or the Israeli security cabinet, were really discussing how to deal not just with Hamas, to deal with the more than 2 million people in the Gaza Strip, and by basically pushing the Palestinians from the north of Gaza, where I used to live before this war erupted, to the south of Gaza, where more than 1.5 million Palestinians are located now in the south of Gaza, the middle and the south of Gaza. It seems to me that Israel is trying to find a final, the so-called the final solution to the Palestinian issue, or to the Palestinians in Gaza, by not just differentiating between the Palestinians and Hamas. And let me just add one piece of information, that many Israelis basically did not differentiate between Hamas and the Palestinians. Basically, they said those Palestinians who live in Gaza, they are supporting Hamas. Even though that there is a good percentage of the Palestinians in Gaza, they do support Hamas, but in no means that means that the majority of the Palestinians or all the Palestinians are members of Hamas. We know that there are Palestinians who are affiliated with Fatah, Palestinians who are affiliated, who are independents or other smaller groups. But it seems to me that that the Israeli military and political establishment was so overwhelmed with what happened on October 7 that they wanted to retaliate in any way, to the point where what we have seen over the past more than 6 months now, the death of Palestinian children, Palestinian women, civilians, the destruction. And I know that these images that we see on Al Jazeera or other regional TVs are not covered in Israeli TV. I know that the Israeli newspaper Haaretz is covering part of what is happening in Gaza. But it seems to me that the majority of Israelis are not aware of war crimes. That's the least can be said about what is happening in Gaza by going after children, Palestinian women and civilians, as Khalid indicated at the beginning of this question. But it's just, now let me remind you, this is not going to be good for Israel. This is not going to be good for the future of the Palestinians and Israelis. Now, I think it's about time that Israel need to rethink its whole approach toward the Palestinians. I remember one time the Israeli well-known journalist Gideon Levy wrote a piece about how the Palestinians have succeeded in more than 50 years now in bringing in new tools or bringing in new ways of fighting back. I don't think this current affair of killing the Palestinians in this magnitude, or destroying almost 80% of the Gaza homes, destroying homes, schools, hospitals, universities, roads, you name it. I mean, at the end of the day, that will just make the Palestinians more angry toward Israel. Yes, part of the Palestinians are blaming Hamas for provoking Israel on October 7, but at the end of the day, it's Israel who is making the Palestinian people suffer, making them displaced and homeless, without homes, no schools. And just to me, when I look at the numbers, and I find that there are thousands of Palestinian orphans or Palestinian children who became orphans. What's going to happen to those orphans in the future? They're going to be fighters against Israel. It seems to me that Israel is losing at the strategic level by creating more enemies by doing this kind of destruction against the civilian population in Gaza.
Thanks, Mkhaimar. If I can, I'd like to follow up with you on a related issue, and that is Rafah. We hear a lot about the Israeli leadership is still talking about they absolutely must go into Rafah and clean it out, the remaining Hamas battalions there, and there's a real fear. I think the fears about what will happen in Rafah are growing every day, particularly after the exchange of missiles between Iran and Israel. And Rafah is also the place where the majority of displaced Palestinians are now sheltering, about 1.5 million of them. And I think most humanitarian and human rights workers have said that there's really no way for Israel to conduct an operation in Gaza without massive civilian casualties, even greater than what we've already seen. And this has also been a concern raised by the Biden administration. So what do you think is going on with Rafah? Do you think an Israeli operation in Rafah is inevitable, or can they be talked out of it? And what would it actually mean for an operation like that to happen for the civilian population? Would we just see massive death, or would there be a push across the border into Egypt, or how do you see that playing out?
Well, thanks, Khalid. This is definitely a very good question. Let me remind you with what Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been saying lately, that he is going after the so-called absolute victory. Now, what is that absolute victory means? I do not even know. How do you define it? But it seems to me that when he says that Israel is going for the absolute victory, that means that Israel will have to go into Rafah and to finish the so-called Hamas 4 brigades that has been left untouched in the Rafah area. But let's just look at this scenario now. Up until now, more than 35,000 Palestinians have been killed. Most of them are Palestinian children and women. And I know that there are thousands of Palestinians are also missing, whether they are inside Israeli jails or they have been killed. We don't even know. But let's assume that this is what happened in the north of Gaza, in the middle of Gaza, in the areas which have been evacuated, that Israel from the beginning asked the Palestinians in the north of Gaza to evacuate to the south. And all of those Palestinians have been killed with the evacuation of the north of Gaza. And as you just mentioned, there are about roughly 1.3 million, more or less, Palestinians crowded in Rafah area, which is usually no more than 250,000 Palestinians live in Rafah, but now more than 1.3 million Palestinians are crowded there. You can't even walk. I mean, I talk to my brothers and my family members who are in Rafah, and it's a human catastrophe there with the density of the people and the density of the tents there. Now, I just do not know how it's going to look like going into Rafah with this massive civilian population. It seems to me that there will be roughly at least 10,000 Palestinians will be killed in Rafah if Israel goes into Rafah with this massive civilian population. And let's just say, okay, Israel goes into Rafah, kill many more Palestinian civilians, children, women, and destroy what is left of the Gaza Strip. Then what? Is Israel going to be able to get the hostages back? I doubt it. It seems to me that whoever has planned this attack on October 7 has very much planned where to hide those Israeli hostages. It doesn't seem to me that going into Rafah will make Israel closer to getting those Israeli hostages back from Hamas. It seems to me it's just inflicting more death and more destruction on the part of the Palestinians. I hope Israel or the Israeli leaders will listen to the international community, to their friends in the US and in the EU and in the region, and not to go with the Rafah invasion, Rafah ground invasion, because if what we have seen over the past 6 months, it seems to me it's going to get more uglier or more nasty with a ground invasion in Rafah. And again, this is just going to create more monsters among the Palestinians. It will create more anger and the appetite for revenge in the future. I hope it doesn't happen, but it seems to me, as I just mentioned at the beginning, that with this right-wing government coalition that Ben Gvir and Smotrich are competing with Netanyahu, what he must do and what he must not do, it seems to me that Netanyahu, to keep his coalition government, it seems to me that he's going to go into a ground invasion in Rafah, no matter what are the consequences.
Thanks for that, and that's really on the nose analysis. Mairav, I want to ask you to sort of pick up on that question of the Israeli government, where it stands. You recently tweeted something to the effect that Israel has already lost this war, a sentiment which other Israeli analysts have also been echoing. What did you mean by this? And what are the implications of this defeat, including on the question of what Israel now does with respect to Rafah?
Yeah, maybe to start on the Rafah thing, just to add to what was said, that Netanyahu's been dangling this threat for months. And I can't help but think it's very similar to how he dangled the threat of annexation before the Abraham Accords. And then poof, he managed to get the Abraham Accords and annexation happened anyway. But the performance of the threat was, and I think he's been doing the same thing here. And so the rumors that now they would leverage, and the US is kind of playing into this theater because it's pushing back, but it's not actually applying enough pressure. I'm not convinced it's actually going to stop Israel from going into Rafah. And he could just continue to dangle this threat and then use it for leverage. It doesn't mean that I don't think that Israel's going to go in. But he's able to dangle this for a long time, and it still would take weeks, I think, for them to get ready to do that. And as Mkhaimar was saying, that's not going to solve the issues here. It's not going to win the war. And as far as Israel losing the war, I mean, a lot of Israelis think that Israel lost on October 7th already. I mean, and that's partly true. But if you look at what's happened in this almost 7 months since, Israel hasn't reached any of its war objectives. It hasn't been able to topple Hamas or get it to surrender. It hasn't gotten to its top leaders. It hasn't returned the hostages. And the minute Hezbollah opened up another front and Israel chose to evacuate citizens as a result of the threat, it also doesn't have a good answer for how to get those people back home. And ironically, or not ironically, but they want a ceasefire, I think, in the north. They want the Israelis to be able to go back there, but they don't want it in the south. And Hezbollah has said, we're not going to even discuss stopping the shooting, or we will stop the shooting once there's a ceasefire. We won't discuss anything further until that happens. So Israel is kind of in a dilemma. And in the meantime, in addition to the failures of having their borders penetrated and the intel failure, Israel is showing that it's not able to actually defeat a non-state actor on its border with all of its military might, with all of its unconditional support from the US. And that's actually hurting its own, ability to appear strong, and not to mention strategic. So it's, I think it's a failure on all those counts. And for Israelis, I think they're really starting to understand now, months into this, that there's just, a total failure. At the same time, I want to caveat that by saying that, the chaos and the destruction that we're seeing in Gaza is, in a lot of ways, the Israeli strategy. Certainly, the depopulation of northern Gaza and kind of taking that chunk of land for now is a strategy, because it's de facto what they've done. And so I don't want to take away from the fact that it could very well be that this is the Israeli strategy and that they are, in their view, actually winning their strategy. It's just going to take a lot longer, right? So they warned that this would be at least a year. They warned it would take a long time. Military intelligence has already admitted that Hamas will remain as a guerrilla terror group of some sort. They don't expect to get rid of every rocket. They don't expect to get rid of every Hamas. So as much as it is a failure, you could also say that this is going exactly according to plan, and that Israel wanted basically to destroy Gaza in a way that will put all the burden on the humanitarian and international community to deal with. So that's another reading as well.
Thanks, Mairav. Mkhaimar, I want to come back to you and touch on a point that you had already noted, and that is, as we all know, the Biden administration and other Western powers have repeatedly expressed frustration at Israel's conduct of the war. Maybe not enough to actually use the leverage that they have, but they've been particularly emphatic about the high civilian death toll. And back in early December, barely 2 months into this war, U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin warned that if Israel did not do more to protect civilians, that they risked replacing, quote, a tactical victory with a strategic defeat, which is the point that you made just a moment ago. And yet we've not seen any real change in how Israel is conducting this war. Gaza City has been replicated in Khan Yunis, and I think that's where the horror of Rafah comes in. So I want to ask you, since Israel has essentially cornered themselves with their kind of absolutist and zero-sum rhetoric, they've kind of limited their own options in a lot of ways. How is it possible that Israel could even extract itself from the place where they're in? And I guess the second part of my question to you would be, do you have any sense that Israelis understand the dangers of the long-term implications of what they're creating in Gaza? You know, you talked about the 17,000 orphans. What are they going to, how are they going to feel when they grow up with that trauma, and where are they going to direct those feelings? Does anyone in the Israeli military establishment sober enough to see the long-term implications of this, and that the huge potential for blowback? Or is it, you know, how does Israel even extract itself from the place that they've put themselves in?
Well, Khalid, let me say the following, that the international community is not innocent on what happened to the Palestinians over the past 6 months. Let me remind you and remind your viewers that many Western countries also are held responsible for what is happening in Gaza. When October 7th happened, most Western leaders came out in very vocal and public statements saying that Israel has to defend itself, without saying at the beginning that entails that Israel must take into consideration the civilian population in Gaza. And also Israel, at the beginning of this retaliation, succeeded in convincing the international community that Israeli babies were beheaded and some Israeli women were raped on October 7th to demonize the Palestinian people in Gaza. Not just, as I mentioned, not just Hamas and PIJ, but to demonize the whole Palestinian community in the Gaza Strip. And I think Israel received a blank check on October 7th and after to do whatever it takes to defend itself, to inflict death and destruction on the Palestinians in Gaza, no matter what happens. It was, as you just mentioned, it was 2 months later when the images of dead children and dead bodies and destruction that was inflicted on Gaza, that the international community started to speak out about the need for protecting Palestinian civilians. It wasn't, in my opinion, until after the ICJ came out in its ruling on January 26, when it said that there is a plausible way of thinking that some genocide is taking place among the Palestinians in Gaza. It wasn't until then that most Western leaders, whether it's US President Biden, Josep Borrell, the foreign affairs personality in the EU, that started to come out publicly and speaking about the need for the protection of Palestinian civilians. But I think for their own political needs. We all know that President Biden started to speak about the need for protection of Palestinian civilians after primaries in Michigan and Illinois, in which many American voters were uncommitted to voting for the Democratic Party or for voting for President Biden in the coming U.S. presidential elections in November. That's when President Biden started to speak about the need not to go into Rafah or the need to protect Palestinian civilians. And also Western countries were afraid for their image as protectors of democracy and human rights and international law. But honestly, at the first 2 months, there were no statements coming from any international leader, whether from the U.S. or from Europe, criticizing Israel or telling Israel that there is a need to do something different. And even though that it's been more than 6 months now, we haven't really seen serious talk between Israel allies, the U.S. or Western Europe, to tell Israel this is not. I mean, saying that this is not going to be good strategically for Israel is one thing, and trying to tell Israel that enough is enough by this killing and destruction. And going back to your question, your second part of the question, the ramifications of this death and destruction among the Palestinians, especially among Palestinian children who have become orphanage as a result of this massacre that has been taking place in Gaza. I just don't. I mean, I would really like some Israelis to try to answer this question, what they think. But at the end of the day, it seems to me that Israeli politicians do not really think what's going to happen 20 years from now. What they care more about is their political future now, or their political future a few years from now. But what happens in 15 or 20 years when those children grow up with no parents or with single parent and they join Hamas or PIJ or whoever is going to be 20 years from now, it seems to me that this is not a big concern for them. But when you look at previous, if you look at previous cases, and I think I'm not just saying this, there have been analysis on most of those who carried out suicide attacks against Israel or carried out the struggle against Israel. Most of those Palestinians were young. They lost either one of their parents, their brothers, or their relatives in the struggle against Israel, and that was like a motive for them to continue the fight against Israel. So studies indicate that many of those Palestinian orphanage will become freedom fighters in the future, whether they are called terrorists by Israel, but in the eyes of the Palestinians, they are freedom fighters fighting for an end to the Israeli occupation and also for the independence of the Palestinians.
So thank you for that. All right, we're running out of time. We have about 15 minutes left, and we have 2 questions left for each of you. So I'm going to ask both of you to try to be tight. Call this a lightning round. Mkhaimar, I want to start with you and ask you about where you see the risk for escalation in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And for folks who've been reading the news, people should know that there has been a rise across the entire West Bank of settler violence, IDF violence. We've had almost daily incursions in the West Bank by the IDF, nearly 500 Palestinians killed since October 7th, extremist settlers, violent rampages, pogroms, often with the active or passive support of the soldiers. At the same time, we have increasing evictions, land confiscations, settlement planning, and a court order. We expect to see demolitions in East Jerusalem with some new policies with Ben-Gvir put in charge. So taking all of that together very briefly, can you talk about how you see East Jerusalem and the West Bank fitting into the current Gaza war and where you see an escalation going?
Well, thank you, Laura, for this question. That is definitely a very good one. Look, if you look at the numbers, yes, since October 7, the number of Palestinians who have been killed by the Israeli army in the West Bank is much bigger compared to other years. and I also, in spite of the sanctions which have been taken by the U.S. government and other Western government against right-wing settlers who are responsible for some of the violent attacks against Palestinian civilians in the West Bank. But that did not stop Israeli violent settlers from going after Palestinian civilians. We all have seen just a week ago how many Palestinian homes were burned down by Israeli settlers, and some Palestinian civilians, including a child, was also killed in those attacks by Israeli settlers, which it seems to me that, I mean, this settler violence is, in my opinion, protected also by the Israeli army. The Israeli army is there. They're witnessing what is happening in the West Bank. Now, I would assume that what is happening in the West Bank right now in East Jerusalem will definitely say that another Palestinian intifada is in the making. What happened in 1987, the first Palestinian intifada, December 1987, and also the second Palestinian intifada in September of 2000, which was much more violent. But circumstances are not very much different. When you talk about settlement expansion, settler violence, continuation of the Israeli occupation, lack of basic freedoms. But it seems to me that what is preventing another Palestinian intifada in the West Bank and East Jerusalem right now is a number of things. One is that the Palestinians are divided, and that is making the Palestinian community very frustrated with their leadership, whether in the West Bank or Gaza. And I think that there is definitely a lack of leadership on the Palestinian people. We all know that President Mahmoud Abbas is a very aging leader. He is 86, 87 years now. He is very much more interested in keeping his position. He's not interested in any violence, even popular resistance against Israel. And I think the PA security services in the West Bank is keeping things under control. Yes, there are instances of clashes in places like Jenin and Nablus, and like what we saw this morning in Nur Shams refugee camp in Tulkarem. But at the end of the day, there is control by the PA security services over the West Bank, and that is, in my opinion, preventing a wide explosion or a big intifada against Israel. But you never know what happens. I mean, even though that the Israeli presence in the West Bank, the PA security services are keeping things under control. But if the situation in Gaza continues as it is right now, with the bloodshed, with the destruction, and Israeli incursions in the West Bank continue, it seems to me that the situation is just escalating further. But I think at the end of the day, one thing is that lack of a Palestinian leadership is preventing another intifada. And I think also maybe the Palestinians in the West Bank look and they watch what is happening to their brothers in the Gaza Strip, killing and destruction, and definitely they do not want to be their cities leveled up like Gaza City, and that's why probably what is preventing them from engaging in armed violence against Israel. But I think it's about time that we need really to speak about the need for a political settlement for the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the need for an end to the Israeli occupation, the need for the two-state solution where the Palestinians have their own state on the 1967 border with East Jerusalem as its capital. And I do really regret the U.S. veto against accepting Palestine as a full member state at the UN system yesterday. We really hope that that the U.S. and Western countries will advocate and will support the creation of a Palestinian state, which will, in my opinion, will put an end to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, will put an end to this cycle of violence and revenge and retaliation. Because at the end of the day, the Palestinians and Israelis have no other way but to live side by side, to live as neighbors next to each other, in spite all of the killing, the bloodshed, and the destruction that is happening right now.
Thanks, Mkhaimar. Mairav, I want to ask you about, as you know, the regional dynamic. In the last couple of weeks, we've seen a major escalation. First, with the apparent Israeli strike on the Iranian consulate in Damascus that killed 3 Iranian generals on April 1st, and then Iran's retaliation last weekend, in which hundreds of drones and missiles were fired at Israel. That was unprecedented. And then just yesterday, we saw what appears to be an Israeli counterstrike inside Iran. Where do things stand now? I mean, the one thing that the Biden administration has said they believe has been successful is trying to prevent a full-out regional war. Are we now at the doorstep of such a regional conflagration, or can things be de-escalated at this point? And what are the implications of that?
Well, we're certainly in uncharted territory, and there's a lot of new rules of the game that are being made as we speak, and it's very precarious, and it's hard to overstate how paralyzing it was last Saturday night for all Israelis to sit, and it's almost more scary than a strike that happens immediately, because you know it's coming and you don't know what to expect. And in that sense, I think it was a very effective strike by Iran. And I also think we need to take into account that an Israeli leader who makes a decision to strike in a consular compound in the middle of a war with several other fronts is, clearly taking into consideration that could escalate things, and it did escalate things. And so it's hard to ignore the fact that since the Iran-Israel situation has escalated, that Gaza, it's a distraction from Gaza, and all the pressure, at least in rhetoric, that we were seeing, and the cracks that we were starting to see against Israel for its destruction of Gaza suddenly is by the wayside. So that's something that's very hard to ignore. I think Israel has on the front with Lebanon, which it understands in some ways now with what's happening in Gaza, that it's actually the biggest threat currently to it. And it has played by certain rules of the game, and it has heeded in a way to the US desire or demand to not reach regional escalation, because you have a situation in the north that is unprecedented as far as the daily fire, the destruction of people's homes, the just inability to live and to have an economy in the north. And that's something that it's on the Israeli government to handle. And instead of working hard to get that front closed, to get a ceasefire, stop the war, and work on getting that front closed, it's now taking risks with Iran. So it's pretty clear where the Israeli government's priorities are. And I think neither Hezbollah nor Iran nor Israel are actually interested in all-out war. I don't think they are. But the level of recklessness and miscalculation is high. And I also think that the governments in Israel and Iran are in some ways very similar as far as being extremely hawkish, a new generation of much more right-wing people who don't necessarily have the same pragmatic approach and don't necessarily understand their adversaries as well. And that's why you have now these new kind of risks happening. And you also have an Iranian regime that is interested in challenging Israel's impunity. And there are also theories that the October 7th attack is, what we talked about before about how Hezbollah didn't know and Iran didn't know. I'm sure that's true, but Iran has built up a network of proxies and a force. And some people think that October 7th was a retaliation for all the things that the US and Israel has done over the years against the Iranian regime. So there is they're all interconnected. There's a bigger aspect at play. And I think what we know and what Biden knows is clear, that you need to have a ceasefire immediately for so many different reasons, but maybe now chief among them, besides the lives in Gaza, is that this could really spark a regional war. So that's something that needs to be, I'm actually very, very, relieved that this was the Israeli response. It could have been a lot worse. I don't think we're completely cleared out of the waters now, because the real challenge and question will be next time Israel targets an Iranian asset or person, military official in Syria or anywhere, because Iran has promised to respond in kind. I think we're now going to see that test when it happens next. So it's a very scary time, but I do think that the diplomatic pressure and flurry played a role in how Israel responded, and we're going to have to wait and see how things pan out. But it's it's a very unpredictable time.
Thanks. I'm listening to your last comment, Mairav. I'm thinking back on Mkhaimar's earlier comments about the role of the international community, and I'm recalling that as far as Washington is concerned, still our line is that the Iranian drone attack was an unprovoked offensive act against Israel, and still, when asked, our official spokespeople do not recognize that what Israel hit was a diplomatic facility. It's sort of looking at the role of the U.S. in that piece as well. And I'd love to dig more into that, but we are out of time. We have lots more questions, and I hope we can maybe have you back in another forum to go into this deeper. So on behalf of the Middle East Institute and the Foundation for Middle East Peace, I want to thank our panelists, Mkhaimar and Mairav, for a very rich and enlightening discussion. And thanks to all who joined us for this webinar, and especially those who submitted questions. We tried to work things in as best we could. We hope you enjoyed today's session. We hope to see you again next Friday for the second installment of the series, which will be focused on the U.S. role and responsibility. That one will be at noon, not at 11. And our panelists will be Zaha Hassan from the Carnegie Endowment, Josh Paul, who's a former State Department official, and Tess McInerney, I think I said her last name right, from the Middle East Democracy Center, formerly known as POMED. So we'll look forward to that then. So until then, on behalf of myself and Khaled, we thank you for coming, and goodbye.